Oh, something's going on. Doesn't seem like it's working. Oh, no.
Hello.
It was there for a moment. So, yeah, Hi, Tim.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can very well.
Sorry, for some reason I can't hear you. There's.
Oh.
Sorry, we are having some minor technical problems here. We're trying to solve it. Right. This works. Great. And now let me check the sound. Was it? Why don't we go to settings? I think it should be in the audio. It might be audio. Yeah. Give me one more second. I will just make Liana co-host. So people don't wait. And I think it should be in these settings. Oh, you think it's here? You saying audio? All right. This one? Choose your. Yeah, choose your output device. And what does it say? Speaker or PC? Sorry. That should be coming out. No, I think there is problem in Zoom.
I'll try.
Let me. Oh, this is.
Is that any better? No. Is that any better? No.
No, I think there is a problem on our side. Something is going on. Yeah, I can't really see now what's going on. Yes. Yeah, here we go. Audio and this works for some reason. What if this doesn't? We could get just Tim, can you try and say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, you can.
Great.
Okay.
Oh, this is
better.
Yeah. Sorry for the technical.
No worries.
It always happens at the.
But anyway, you can hear me fine now.
Yes, finally.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. How are you doing?
Okay. All right.
Right. Do you want to try and test whether you are capable of sharing your screen, or
I'll just give it a go. Because I haven't got many things, but here we go. I'll just give it a try.
All right. Oh, great.
So you should see some things.
Yes, we can see it very clearly.
Okay, that's fine.
That's perfect. Right. So I wanted to ask you, you are at the moment at University of Aberdeen, right?
Yes, although technically I'm retired.
Oh, all right. So you're not teaching anymore?
No, I retired in 2018.
Oh,
So I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Aberdeen, but I'm otherwise working at home.
all right, right. So, but you are still active in publishing, as I.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And now I at last have time to do stuff. Retirement is an excellent kind of research leave. So it goes on forever.
Yeah, I think that even these strange times can be a bit helpful in this, that we are kind of stuck at home, and for some people it can be like creatively stimulating, I suppose, to just create papers. Yeah. So yeah, I think we will give people some 2-3 more minutes, and then we can start slowly. So are you at the moment, like, do you have these kind of talks from time to time still, or kind of
Quite a lot, yes. No, I'm all over the world on from my study. So life is pretty busy.
All right. What has been occupying you lately the most?
Oh, I don't know. I have a to-do list, and I just work through it. So it's one thing after another. I would take, I don't know. I got a lot of things finished last year, and at the moment I'm just catching up on a lot of little things. No one big thing in particular.
Oh, all right, all right. I've also seen that you've kind of changed, well, when you were still studying, you changed your kind of career path, like halfway through from studying like science or like environments, and then you went to anthropology. How was that for you? How difficult was this kind of?
It was easy. I mean, that was a long time ago. It was in 1967.
Yeah.
And it was easy because with the Cambridge system, I suppose it's the same in Oxford too. The tripos system, you do a part 1 and a part 2, and it doesn't matter. You do part 1 in some subjects and part 2 in another subject, and it doesn't matter if they're completely different subjects. So I did my part 1 in natural sciences and part 2 in anthropology, but actually the education authority that was paying my fees, as say your fees were paid all in those days, allowed me to go back and do the first year again. So I did all 3 years of archaeology and anthropology, which was quite important because it meant that I got some anthropology and physical, some archaeology and physical anthropology into my formation, which actually made quite a bit of difference later on.
All right.
But that was a long time ago.
As someone who's, yeah, as someone who studied at Cambridge, have you been to Oxford quite a few times as well, or not really?
Yes, oh yes. I've been to Oxford. I don't know it that well, but
yeah. Right. I feel like any latecomers who wanted to come are with us at the moment. So yeah, we are good to start. Hello and welcome everyone. After 1 week pause, we are back with our kind of term talks for Oxford Archaeological Society. We are very happy to see so many of you joining us remotely and in person as well. It's great to see new faces around. And our today's guest is Tim Ingold, Professor Emeritus at University of Aberdeen, who contributes still actively and extensively to our understanding of human environment and human material relations. And in his most recent publication, Imagining for Real, he touched upon formation or formative processes of imagination in most aspects of human life. And hopefully we will hear a bit more about this in relation to material things in his talk today. So I'm leaving this virtual stage to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to begin with a very, very simple question. And the question is, what does it mean to join things? It's a very simple question, but the answer is anything but. I mean, clearly, coherence in the world depends on things being joined. And clearly, to inhabit a world, it has to have some kind of coherence. But when you start looking for them, joins are everywhere. And they exist in so many different forms that it's almost bewildering in their variety. There are knots and bindings and ties and ligaments and seams and stitches and catches and couplings and clasps and fastenings and hooks, hangers, clips, pegs, bolts, screws, and so on and so on. There are a million ways in which things can be joined. And we have in English and in other languages similarly, an equally rich vocabulary of words for joining things. I found in the Oxford English Dictionary, add, accompany, apply, assemble, append, annex, attract, articulate, adhere, aggregate, associate. All of these have to join among their many meanings, and that's only words beginning with the letter A. So you could have find any number more if you start looking for them. But behind all these different words, there does seem to be a rather fundamental contrast, which I want to emphasize. And that's between joining up and joining with. And let me just to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to share my screen and show you a little experiment. I hope this works. Share from beginning, slideshow from the beginning. There we are. I hope now that you can see a little diagram. Now, imagine here, what I've done is take a sheet of paper and marked on it 4 points with a pen, and I've taken a ruler and joined them up. So I've created a little network, a network of connections. We might say, okay, those 4 points are joined up into a network. But then suppose that you take your pen and starting at each of these points, you draw a line, a sort of continuous line that carries on. Or you could imagine each of these lines as something like a thread. And then you see that over here, these threads get a bit tangled up together into what we might call a nexus. So we have a network over on the left-hand side of joined up points, but where these lines join up with one another, we end up with a nexus. Now, both network and nexus come from the Latin nectere, meaning to bind, from which incidentally also comes the word necessity. So there's a kind of necessity in both of these. But is this a necessity of predetermination, of things being joined up, or is it a necessity of constraint? Constraint literally means tying together. So we have two kinds of necessity here, a necessity of predetermination and a necessity of constraint. And I want to show that these relate to the difference between being on the one hand and becoming on the other. So anyway, we have joining up and joining with. Joining up is what is commonly called articulation, and it yields an assemblage. But I want to argue that joining with is something different. It is what I'm going to call a correspondence, and it leads to a gathering. So articulation to correspondence is as assemblage as to gathering. Those are the sort of key terms of the argument I want to present. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that everything in the world is joined with rather than joined up, or that it's all joined up rather than joined with. What I am arguing is that we need to take both together, both joining up and joining with, both articulation and correspondence, both assemblage and gathering, in order to understand how we can produce and inhabit a world which seems chock-a-block with entities and their connections, yet in which everything takes time to build or to grow, and in which nothing ever lasts forever. Now, just these days, the word assemblage is very much in vogue. It is, we could say, a must-have accessory for every aspiring theorist. Always use assemblage if you have the chance. And it sounds rather highfalutin, importance and deep, theoretical. The attraction of this concept of assemblage lies in the fact that it offers a kind of compromise between either thinking that when you put things together, they sacrifice any individuality they might once have had for the whole of which they are now intrinsically a part, or on the other hand, that when you put things together, they merely associate and everything retains its own particular individuality, so that they're not really affected by their association at all. The beauty of the assemblage is it enables us to say how, when you put things together, you do get emergent effects, that things come into existence that weren't there before, but nevertheless, every part retains its own particularity, its own singularity. So that in assemblage thinking, it's supposed that the elements that you're putting together, the elements that form the assemblage, adhere to one another from the outside. There is an external relation between them. It's not that they all sort of merge into one great whole, which is greater than the sum of its parts. They do come together to create something more than the sum of their parts, but they nevertheless retain their own particular character. So everything there is then exists fundamentally in and for itself. And according to assemblage theorists, it is as such that we should attend to it. And this is, of course, the founding premise of what has become known rather fashionably as the new materialism. Actually, new materialism is a sort of brand name for a range of approaches which are not all compatible with one another. The one thing I suppose that they have in common is the premise that we should take materials seriously, rather than thinking of them, say, as simply placeholders for human intentions and purposes, which is to know things, materials actually exist in their own right. They have their own proclivities, tendencies, and we need to pay attention to them. Now, of course, the word assemblage has been around for a long time. So far as I can tell, it goes back to the philosophy of John Locke in 1690, where he used the term to refer to an assemblage of ideas. But later on, in the 18th and particularly in the 19th centuries, the term assemblage came to be very widely used, first in the field of geology, and particularly paleontology, where you would use the word assemblage to refer, for example, to the distribution or spread of fossilized bones or remains at a particular geological site. And from there, it then spread to archaeology, particularly in the work of John Lubbock and others in the mid-19th century, when again, the assemblage was simply the spread, distribution of bits and pieces, artifactual bits and pieces in a particular archaeological deposit or site. And it's in this sense that it has continued to be used in archaeology right up to today. But in the new materialism, for which assemblage is also a central concept, the use of the term assemblage within the new materialism comes from a quite different source, not in that history I just traced through the history of ideas, through geology, paleontology, and archaeology, but from a quite different source, and that is as a translation of the French term agencement. The word agencement in French comes from the verb agencer, which means something like fitting together, as in a flower arrangement or a layout, something like that. Assemblage came in as a translation of this word agencement, rather difficult to translate into English. Now, one can quibble about the translation, and it might sound like splitting hairs to worry about the difference between assembling things and arranging things. But at stake philosophically is the whole question that I began with of what does it mean to join things? Now, the reason why assemblage came into the literature in new materialism is that when the philosopher Brian Massumi set out to undertake the massive task of translating the enormous sprawling meditations of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, called 1000 plateaux, 1000 plateaus, when he started translating this hundreds and hundreds of pages of meditations into English, Massumi chose to translate the French word agencement, which was very central for Deleuze and Guattari, as assemblage. And that's how the word assemblage came into the Anglophone literature. Now, Deleuze and Guattari never really explain what they mean by agencement. You can look, they're using the term all the time, but you can't find a clear explanation exactly of what they mean by it. But they do offer a useful comparison. And that comparison is to compare a jigsaw puzzle with a dry stone wall. So let's have the dry stone wall in front of us. This is a typical dry stone wall. I actually took this just a couple of miles from my home in Aberdeen. It goes back 200 or 300 years, I think, this one. So let's compare the dry stone wall with a jigsaw puzzle. With a jigsaw puzzle, every piece has a rather irregular shape. But when the puzzle is assembled, you eventually arrive at a picture, the picture that is, the picture for the puzzle that you're putting together. And once the puzzle is complete, the singularity of each piece simply disappears into the whole picture of which they are now intrinsically a part. So in that case, one can perfectly well say with the jigsaw puzzle, that when you join all the pieces together, every piece surrenders. Every piece surrenders its rather peculiar, unique individual identity for the picture of which it now becomes an integral part. And there is, of course, just one solution for the jigsaw. But with building a wall, it's quite different, because when you build a wall, you have a lot of stones lying around that you're using as your raw material. Maybe they've been quarried and hauled to the site. So you're looking around and choosing one stone and then another from the range of stones that are available. But the wall builder is taking stones pretty much as he finds them and improvising a layout as he goes along. So he's deciding after each stone is put into place, he then looks around to find another one and then another one. The solution to the arrangement of the wall is not in any sense given in advance. And even when the work is done and the stones are all laid up in position, then each stone retains its own particular singularity. So every one of these stones is unique and doesn't in any way give up its uniqueness for the wall of which it is now an integral part. So, and once the stones are in position, well, then they're gradually achieving a kind of settlement amongst themselves. So even when the work of wall building is finished, there's still stuff going on in the wall as the stones gradually settle and find a resting place, each in relation to the other. So we could say that the wall coheres thanks to an emerging settlement among the stones themselves. And that is what makes it, in the terms of Deleuze and Guattari, an agencement. And what holds the wall together then are the relations between the elements and not the subsumption of each under the whole of which they are parts, as in the jigsaw puzzle. And that's why Deleuze and Guattari can insist that the relations of stones in the wall are relations of exteriority. Each stone is outside each other stone. They're not incorporated within a larger whole. And that's why Deleuze and Guattari call these relations machinic rather than organic, because in their terms, machinic relations are when you take a machine, the relation between the parts of the machine are exterior relations, not internal ones. Whereas in an organism, they are in some sense interior, that each cell in an organism sort of enfolds within itself the relations with all the other cells. But in the machine, the parts are related in an external way. But then you think, well, if that's what they mean, if they mean that you just have a juxtaposition of elements here, a juxtaposition of stones relating to one another from the outside, then why bother with a complicated term like agencement? Why did Deleuze and Guattari not simply speak of the wall as an assemblage? After all, the word exists in both equally in both French and English. In French, assemblage, in English, assemblage, to mean a juxtaposition of bits and pieces to form some kind of a layout. So if that's all it is, then Deleuze and Guattari could perfectly well have used the word assemblage instead of agencement, and everybody would know what they were talking about. Now, I think there is a reason why they used this word agencement rather than assemblage. And it is because I want to argue that there are two sides to agencement. There's an outer side that it reveals and an inner side that it conceals. The outer side is what we see here, the juxtaposition of singular elements. But on the inner side that's hidden are the forces and energies through which these elements are brought forth or produced. And I think the power of the idea of agencement lies in its capacity to affect a kind of modulation from one side to the other. Now, what I want to argue is that the shadow of the assemblage is the gathering, and that only by taking the two together, the assemblage and the gathering, the thing and its shadow, can we understand things not just in their arrangement, but also in how they come into being and gradually pass away. So let's go back to assemblage for a moment. Assemblage is about adding things up. So we add the stones up into a wall. And to add things up, they have first to be separated from one another, and then they have to be articulated. So the stones are first maybe split up. Maybe they were all originally in the quarry, so they've been hacked out of the quarry. So each stone is separate from each and every other stone, and then they are articulated, joined up with one another. Now, is a sort of formula. You could say, well, let every stone be, we'll call that an element, and we're adding together the elements into the wall. E1 plus E2 plus E3 plus, and so on and so forth. But then and you could say that, well, every element is different. It's very heterogeneous, this wall. Every stone is a different sort of shape. It might even be of a different geological composition. So E1, E2, E3, they're all different from one another. But what about the plus signs? The plus signs all seem to be identical and even interchangeable. So what do these plus signs stand for? What is hidden behind each of the plus signs in the formula E1 plus E2 plus E3 and so on? And of course, what is hidden is the work of addition. And when you're talking about a stone wall, the work means heaving those stones into place. I mean, stones don't add themselves up into a wall of their own accord. You have to bring in the labor of the wall builders, who are maybe lifting the stones to the site and then lifting them up and placing them into position. Now, each of those, of heaving the stone into position, is an operation. So let's call that O. So behind every one of these plus signs is an operation, O1, O2, O3. And each of those operations too is different from each and every other. So maybe then, and if you add those operations together, you get a sequence of operations. It's what the prehistorian André Leclerc-Gourand famously called the chaîne opératoire, a very central concept in prehistory, the operational chain. So O1 plus O2 plus O3, that's what should be familiar to all archaeologists. That's the chaîne opératoire of Leclerc-Gourand. But now if you compare this series E1 plus E2 plus E3 and O1 plus O2 plus O3, perhaps you say, well, let's just put the two series together and we'll end up with a single chain, E1, O1, E2, O2, E3, O3. And we'll just say, okay, we've got an assemblage of all these things. But I think that would be a mistake, because I think there is a fundamental difference between these two series, between the E series and the O series. And this is that operations cannot simply be added up like that. Each operation, if you will, is more like the strand of a braid, because every stone, when you're talking about the gathering, every stone has its story, or every stone is its story. And when you bring the stones together, you're also bringing these stories together, the story of how each stone was quarried and hauled to the site and lifted into place, and how once it was into place, it began to relate to all the other stones, and maybe the things, the mosses, the lichens, the plants that began to root themselves on or between in the crevices between the stones, and so on. And so you end up with a braided tangle of stories that are carrying on through time, which means that the relations of the O series are not additive, but what I'm going to call complicated. I mean, literally, complication comes from the word com, means together, pli means to fold. So complication means being folded together. But actually, the Latin language from which the word complicate comes was already onto this distinction that I'm really trying to get at. Here are a whole load of words. I'm sure you could find much more. There's a whole series of words of Latin derivation that can take the alternative prefixes ad or at, sometimes modulated depending on the following consonant, and con. At or ad means at, like juxtaposed next to. Con means with. So we got a fundamental contrast between atness and withness. Adjoin versus conjoin. adhere versus cohere, admit versus commit, apply versus comply, attract versus contract, attend versus contend, attribute, contribute, aggregate, congregate, attain, contain, addendum, compendium. I'm sure if you put your mind to it, you could find a lot more. And every one embodies the same contrast. It's the contrast that I'm trying to draw between the assemblage and the gathering. The thing is that at cuts transversely across things, whereas when we with con, we go along together with things. And simply take adhere versus cohere. When you say two things adhere, they stick. You take one thing, put some glue on, stick it to another thing, and they adhere, fine. They're next to one another. But when you say they cohere, it means that with that connection that you've made carries on through time, so that they actually hold together over a period. So that where atness is transverse, cuts across, con or withness is longitudinal. It goes along. It's a matter of entering into the grain of things and going along with them. The opposition between aggregation and congregation brings that out very well. In the aggregation, you could talk about the aggregation of people in a crowd. They just happen to come together to be in the same space at the same time, an aggregate of individuals. But in the congregation, people come together to perform a service. And as they come together in the public enactment of their service, they trail their life histories behind them and carry them along in their going along together in their performance of the rituals or whatever. So we would say that the congregation is not just an aggregate of people, it's not just a crowd, it is a gathering, a coming together of life paths. In rather the same way as we might think of the way of the coming together of the tracks of a herd of animals, which they lead a pattern of track trails on the ground. It goes back, if you will, I just go back to my very first picture. It's like this entangling of lines on the left. It's more like a nexus than a network. Oops. So to imagine the wall as a gathering is to join with the story of each stone as it arrives and settles. And even after the wall is built, you can still ask, what is going on between these stones? They are in a sense conversing with one another, and all sorts of things are happening there as plants are taking root, as lichens are forming, and so on. So we're putting the whole wall, the gathering of stones, into the dimension of time. This, if you will, is the wall's walling. And this, I just wanted to show, this is whilst I was working this whole argument out, when I'm thinking things through, I tend to be sketching, and to sketch, I use the backs of cornflakes packets. So this is actually a sketch with a barrow on the back of a cornflakes packet, which I made as I was trying to figure this out. And as you see, I've marked the elements, the stones, E1, E2, E3, E4, E5, E6, E7. They're each marked as a sort of cross section of a block. And then I thought of each operation as a strand that goes through and carries on. And these strands form a sort of braid. And so looking transversely, that's the assemblage, and looking longitudinally, that's the gathering. So that sort of sums up the way I was trying to think about all this. So looking at it longitudinally, we have the walls walling. And in the gathering, the stones become part of each other's stories. And that's why you can't simply put plus signs between them. The stones in the wall, in short, are not adjoined, but conjoined. The relations among them are not additive, but contrapuntal. And the idea of counterpoint here coming, of course, from music. In musical counterpoint, melodic lines carry along together, say in a string quartet or in a choir. The melodic lines are carrying along together and responding to one another as they go. So gathering, in my argument, gathering differs from assemblage just as complication differs from addition. But again, this is not an either or choice. Quite to the contrary, my argument is that we can't have one without the other. Just as you can't have a shadow without the thing that casts it, you can't have a gathering without the assemblage. But on the dark side, things, on the side of the gathering, things are not attached from without, but differentiated from within. And I'm calling this differentiation from within, by the rather elaborate term, interstitial differentiation. The way in which things are continually distinguishing themselves from one another in the course of their going along together. It's a kind of splitting from the inside. And this is what you could call the minor sense of agencement that is concealed behind the major sense of assembly. The major sense is on the outward side, the minor is on the dark side. The major sense is revealed, the minor sense concealed. And this concept, the beauty of the concept of agencement, and the reason why I think Deleuze and Guattari use it rather than assemblage or assemblage, is that it allows or makes possible a switch from the major to the minor key. And I want to emphasize here, and using this diagram again, that the major and the minor, the assemblage and the gathering, are not diametrically opposed, but orthogonal to one another, at right angles to one another. So as in this diagram, we're talking about a 90-degree switch from the lateral or transverse to the longitudinal. It's like the difference between going across from one side of the bank of a river to the other to joining the water flowing along in between. So this is a 90-degree switch from the assemblage going transversely to the gathering, which is going longitudinally. Transverse relations then are of articulation, but longitudinal ones are of correspondence. And incidentally, I'd just like to put in a note here to say, this is why I don't actually like the concept of interaction that has become terribly fashionable recently, largely through the influence of the work of the philosopher of science, Karan Barad. Barad and I are pretty much in agreement, actually, in terms of the way we're thinking about what I call interstitial differentiation, or what Barad calls splitting together apart, and things differentiating from one another as they go along together. But I don't think the concept of interaction gets it, partly because it suggests a 180-degree switch rather than a 90-degree switch, and partly because it's still stuck with this notion of action. I prefer the term correspondence, both because it allows us to switch 90 degrees rather than 180, but also because it has this element of responsiveness inside the word. The things are going along together and responding to one another as they go. So what I'm calling correspondence, which has become sort of rather central term in my own thinking, what I'm calling correspondence is a process in which things continually answer to one another. And it means that in their growth, in their movement, in their formation, that is in their gathering, things have a certain elasticity, taking into themselves something of the others to which they respond. So in correspondence, in the complication of folding together things meet one another, not on the outside, but from within. So whereas the constitutive relations of the assemblage are of exteriority, the relations of the gathering, and this is key, are of interiority. They are relations on the inside. Now, I said that this word complication literally means folding forwards longitudinally, a way of kind of braiding or plaiting along their own lines of growth and movement. So again, in this figure, you see a sort of braid where these lines are folding forward together along the line of movement. So in the shadow of the material world, with its contingently assembled things, there lies, I suggest, a world of materials, a world that is forever creative, forever surpassing itself. And the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, writing in the early decades of the 20th century, had a lovely word for this. He called it concrescence. Crescent, like when we talk about the crescent moon, it's not a full moon, it's a crescent moon, means undergoing creation, not yet finished. So by crescents, he referred to the becoming of things. He referred to a creative movement that is always going on and never complete. And the con in concrescent, of course, means together, means withness. So concrescence means continually undergoing creation together. And that was Whitehead's idea of how we should understand a world of materials. So if the assemblage is formed by the accretion of bits and pieces from without, the gathering is formed through a process of concrescence from within. And they have different understandings of what the material world is like. I mean, the first assemblage sort of imagines the world made up of chunks. And let's go back to the stone wall, right? And here in this wall, you could say, well, every stone is a chunk. And we put all those chunks together and we end up with a wall. So if we're assemblage thinking, imagines a sort of chunky world of this kind. But if we think in terms of gathering, of concrescence, we have to recognize too that things are prone to buckling, to distortion, to collapse, that the world of chunks is not as solid as it looks, though actually we have a world of flux. And in a world of flux, things arise not from compounding elements into more and more complex formations. They arise rather from taking a whole and folding and creasing it. The best example I can think of, I can just demonstrate it to you. Just a moment. I'm going to take a piece of paper from my file. Here's a sheet of paper from my file. I'm going to crunch it up like this. Small ball, right? And now I'm going to unfold it. And I've got a rather beautiful surface full of creases, of valleys, of features. It's like a really complicated landscape. Now imagine this is a sort of rather two-dimensional thing, but imagine I'd done the same thing with a sponge or something in 3 dimensions and opened it all out. I would then end up not with lots and lots of things put together. I would end up rather with a world that is a continuous matter, but that continuum full of heterogeneities, full of places of where the matter is very compressed, other places where it's less compressed, folds, creases, clumps, and those are all irregularities within the continuous matter of the world itself. So that's how we would imagine a world in flux. So the best example, I think, to illustrate what I'm trying to get at in putting these two things together is nothing other than concrete. Concrete is a wonderful example because most concretes are made out of three components. There's what is called the aggregate, which is usually a mixture in different portions of sand and gravel. There's water, and there's cement, which is the binding agent. So you mix the cement with the aggregate, add the water, and then pour your mixed cement into the mold and wait for it to harden. Of course, when concrete first began to be marketed, it was called sort of instant rock. It solidifies immediately, said its manufacturers, but actually it doesn't, because the chemical reactions that bond concrete together go on and on and on, more or less forever. They never actually stop. And in many early concretes, manufacturers discovered to their cost that one byproduct of these slow burn reactions that go on within concrete is water, and that concrete can crumble from within over time because water begins to seep from its insides. It's why when you often see reinforced concrete that's been smashed by some accident or explosion, you see that the steel components of the reinforced, they're all rusted, because actually the concrete inside was full of damp. So anyway, I think the archaeologist Gavin Lucas has said that concrete is concrescence. It's actually a material that is continually going on and transforming over time, although we like to think of it as absolutely solid. But then you think about how concrete works. Well, there's the aggregate, let's say lots and lots of bits of gravel, which is sometimes called an assemblage of bits of gravel that gives the substance, the body to the concrete, if you like. But then there's the cement, which acts as a binding agent. And the cement works its way in between every little bit of sand, every little bit of gravel, and glues it all together. So the cement works as a binding agent, a kind of glue, which slips between the particles so as to form a continuous weave. So you see, the aggregate in concrete, the aggregate forms as an assemblage, but it's the cement that performs the gathering. So I said that the wall is made out of chunks, but hiding in the shadow of the chunk is what we could call the bag. So concrete is both chunky, that's the aggregate, and baggy, that's the cement. The chunk, every chunk is finite, but the bag is woven from thread lines that extend indefinitely, like sort of fibers, throughout the whole material. So the chunks, if you will, give the thing substance, give it heft, but the weave gives it coherence. So let me give you just a couple more examples to clinch the point. And my first example is a perfectly ordinary brick wall. So you have the wall builder, he's got a pile of bricks, each brick cut to a pretty perfectly rectangular form. And he also has a bucket, a mortar, and a trowel. So he puts one row of bricks on another, and with every brick he layers some mortar both above and to one side, so that it then nestles in next to the brick before, and the other brick will nestle in after that. So you might say, okay, this wall is made up out of bricks, which happens to have mortar in between. So, but then you could also say, well, actually, the wall is made out of mortar, which happen to have bricks in between. If you imagine the wall and abstract away all the bricks, what are you left with? Not lots of pieces put together, but actually a continuous, rather complex topological weave of mortar. Take away the mortar, and you're left with a whole number of chunky rectangular bricks. So the wall in toto, the wall coheres because it's both of these things. I mean, obviously it wouldn't have any substance if it wasn't for the bricks, but it wouldn't have any coherence if it wasn't for the mortar. And you have to put the two together. The bricks are chunky, the mortar is baggy. One is like a mosaic of juxtaposed pieces. The other is like more like a weave of materials, like a fabric. Now let me give you a second example. Imagine that you are making a kit, say a model aeroplane, an airfix kit, you know, the kind you used to get from maybe still from the model shop. You buy a kit and you open it and you find that it's full of perfectly molded plastic, usually plastic parts, and there's an instruction manual which tells you which parts go where and in what order to insert them, so that eventually, it's a bit like assembling a jigsaw, eventually you put all the parts together and you end up with the complete aeroplane. The instructions tell you that yes, you need all the parts, and here they all are, and make sure you identify them all. And actually there's one other thing you'll need. Maybe it's supplied in the box, maybe it isn't. You will need a tube of glue. So then you say to yourself, well, where does the glue fit in all of this? Is the glue another part, or is it something else? Well, what does glue do? In most proprietary glues, chemically consist of very long protein molecules. And at the molecular level, I mean, if you're glue and you're encountering what looks to us like a flat, perfectly flat, plain surface of, smooth surface of plastic, what you actually see is a molecular lattice. And you probe the lattice with your long protein molecule and send your little, your tip deep down into the lattice. On one side, and when you're gluing these two things together, you penetrate equally far into the other side. And then as the glue dries, it contracts and pulls these two together. So actually what the glue is doing is a kind of stitching operation in which it's literally weaving the chunky elements of plastic together. And when the glue's dried, what you have is a very tight woven mesh that holds the whole thing in place and stops it from falling apart. So again, we have these two elements, the glue providing the weave, the plastic providing the substance, the chunks. One gives one is an assemblage and the other a gathering. But then let me get back finally to the wall. I mean, here in the case, this is a dry stone wall, so there is no binding agent. There's a certain amount of mud and stuff that's accumulated in the cracks, but when the wall was built, no mortar was applied or anything like that. It was simply put together from the stones as they were found. Now, clearly, and it's a very strong wall. It would take a lot to knock it down, but it's clearly it's strong not because of any property of the stones themselves, because the stones may be absolutely rock hard, as indeed they are, but a badly made wall will fall down at the slightest provocation, however hard the stones are. So the coherence of the wall cannot lie in the hardness of the stones themselves. It, of course, lies in the way in which each of those stones relates to every other. Each stone must rest on the other at a minimum of 3 points, and that's what it creates then is a sort of force field that spreads throughout the entire wall, something like a weave. So again, the strength of the wall lies in what is going on between the stones. We could say in this case that the wall is self-binding. So just to sum up, we have here both the assemblage and the gathering. And my argument is that we must see both sides together. There's been an enormous amount of loose and frankly ridiculous talk about the agency of matter, of material objects in literature recently, much of which is entirely circular. I mean, the point is made, that things, objects, stones, have effects when they're placed in the world, and clearly, the world would be different if this wall wasn't here, and stones would be different if they didn't have other stones put on top of them. So simply by virtue of its presence, things have an effect. But theorists are so bound up in cause-effect thinking, they think, well, if there's an effect, there must be a cause, and therefore this cause must lie in the agency of the stone. Therefore, the stone's agency produces the effects it has in the world, which is kind of ludicrous. To say that the stones have agency is simply another way of saying that it exists, and because it exists, its presence has a certain effect. So when we encounter a stone wall, let's not say, as indeed one or two archaeological theorists have said in relation specifically to Hadrian's Wall, wow, just look at the combined effect of the non-human agency of the stones, something has been forgotten. And what's been forgotten is all that relentless hard work of the Roman centurions or whoever it was, who heaved these stones into place. So the heft of the wall is there only because, or has its source in, the effortful heave of its builders. Heft is to heave as assemblage is to gathering. So next time you admire a wall, spare a thought for the labors of those who made it and whose ghostly presence still lurks in the interstices amidst the deepening shadows of the stones. Thank you very much. Now I'll escape from this and come back again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim, for this theoretically challenging talk, I have to say. It wasn't one of the easiest one, at least for me. I will be completely honest with you. But yeah, I have a few questions I would like to ask. And if anyone in the audience feels the same, just feel free to write your question down in the chat, and I will read it out loud, or you can raise your hand and ask your question directly. But until then, I want to start by asking, you were talking a lot about network versus nexus, adherence versus coherence, assemblage and gathering. I would still like to know, like, where do you see the border between the two, if there is one? Like, when is the assemblage, for example, changed into gathering, if we can make the clear distinction between the two?
You could ask, where do you find the border between a thing and its shadow? It's not really like you got, here's one thing and here's another thing, and there's some kind of intermediate zone between them. It's two perspectives, if you will, on the same thing. It's just what happens when we ask different questions about them. So we might ask a question about something about how does something have so much mass? How does it weigh? How does it, we might even ask, how does it feel that somehow, what holds it? You take a stone and you think, look at the stoniness of this stone, this heaviness and everything. Well, then you're looking at it one way, but then you start saying, well, now let's look at the story of this stone. How did it come to be the way it is? How did it come to be where it is? Then you've moved over into a different register. and so it's not that we're looking at the sort of two different things. uh, it's not the same as, for example, if you say, well, if you've got trees dropping their leaves in autumn, and well, where do we start? Where do the trees end and the leaves begin? It's not quite like that. It's more like a switch of perspective, which is almost, I suppose, it's almost it's like a figure ground thing, like in those optical puzzle things. What's the right word for them? When one moment you see a beautiful woman, and the next moment you see a witch. Those funny pictures which you can see. Once you've seen it one way, it's really very hard to see it the other way, and then you manage to switch, and then so you switch back and forth between these different perspectives, but it's the same picture, something like that.
And then, would you say that we can look at every material basically around us from both perspectives and
yeah.
to the same extent, or is there a difference to which we can look at some things in one way and to others in other?
I think I would be inclined to say that we would need to look at this everything, that everything affords both perspectives and requires both perspectives, for the simple reason that everything exists in time. And it is that temporal aspect about how things last, how they endure in time. That's when the gathering perspective comes in, so I think it sort of applies pretty much to everything.
All right, thanks. Michael, you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Tim. My name is Michael Ledbetter. I work on urbanism. I was wondering if your ideas about linkages and connections had been influenced at all by the kind of more than human anthropologists and cultural studies theorists like Donna Haraway's ideas about making kinship.
Well, I don't know which way around to put it, because they're onto the same thing, but I wouldn't claim to have been influenced by them, because I've been thinking of these things long before they got in on the act, and I find a lot of it. I mean, Donna Haraway, usually I'm thinking along the same lines as her, but I can't stand her style, which I think is just stupid. I mean, quite ostentatiously, look at me, how clever I am. I really don't like it. And the more than human people, I mean, it is that's where I'm at. I'm thinking I'm been thinking in these terms, but I've been thinking of in these terms for at least since the mid 1980s. And what's really kind of annoying, sorry, it's really annoying when anthropologists and archaeologists too, have actually been working on things like human-animal relations, human-material relations for ages, and it's nothing new to any practicing fieldworking anthropologist or archaeologist. The idea, that materials have their own particular proclivities, ways of doing things, that they affect what people can do, and so on. This is sort of obvious. And then these cultural theorists saying, look at us, we've suddenly discovered these things and how important it is, and they put out all their writings and everybody has to refer to them. So I think, why do I have to refer to Haraway just because she's come across an idea 20 years later than I have? So and I feel a bit the same about a lot of this more than human stuff. They're simply catching up on where we've been for ages, and catching up in an enormously pretentious and tendentious and modish way, and that makes me annoyed.
Is there a way that we can get them to start referring to the archaeology, do you think? Or possibly we don't want them to, maybe.
I wish. I mean, there's an old sort of hierarchy, isn't there, where some disciplines think that they're at the top of the tree, and the ideas are supposed to trickle down to lesser beings who are usually closer to fieldwork and empirical research of one sort and another. And there used to be a time when archaeologists were lesser beings in relation to anthropology. I thought we were always looking up to anthropologists again. And there's this sense, I've heard it from people. I've asked them, why are you always referring to Latour or Haraway or one of these people? Oh, because, you know, we're supposed to, because we're told that's what you do. And I think actually, you know, you probably know a lot more than they do because you've actually been working with stuff. So I don't know. There's so much. It's a poison of the academic world. All this fashion following and having to follow one turn or another. I don't know whether you'll ever get philosophers don't listen very much to what ordinary people are doing, but they're usually a bit. Well, I tend to think of philosophers that they're not actually very good at thinking straight. So one should never be in awe of philosophers. I think so. That's
Thanks, Tim.
Right. Yeah, I have the last question, and there would be. Sorry. Thank you. I think he and I will also can have one question. Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah. You can come over here as well. Yeah.
It feels like stepping up into the courtroom.
You have this complicated hybrid arrangement.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. I was surprised by two things. The first one was when you talked about the orthogonality between gathering and assemblage. I wondered if I understand that works perfectly well when you build a wall, but if once you start building a road, for example, I think the assemblage and the gathering both operate horizontally. So you know, you gather your stones in the same direction as you build the wall, basically, not the road, I mean.
Yeah, but if you're, it depends what kind of road it is. But supposing you're making a road out of, supposing it's a tarmac road and you're surfacing it with asphalt. Okay, then it's a bit like concrete in that way. You've got the ingredients of gravel and some sort of tarmac, which acts again as a binding agent, and so that this tar, which is semi-liquid when it comes out of the, you know, this huge, you see people doing road surfacing, there's a sort of lorry with an immense furnace burning, producing this liquid tar that comes out and sort of rolls all around and gets mixed up with the gravel. So that tar is sort of running, seeping in and around, weaving around all the bits of gravel to form this solid surface. So I wasn't talking specifically about horizontality and verticality, but more about the difference between transverse and along, or between the transverse and the longitudinal. Or perhaps another image might be, imagine an archipelago of islands, and in between, you know, and these islands are situated in an ocean, and there's water flowing in and around between all the islands, all sorts of complicated currents going this way and that. So the tar is like the ocean and the gravel is like the currents. And what I meant by the 90-degree shift is that if you were to draw a line between two islands, then the direction of flow of the water would not be from one island to another, but orthogonally in between the two. You get it?
I hope so. I think so, actually. No, thank you very much.
I mean, it's quite important. The point comes straight out. It's not my argument. It comes from Deleuze, really, but he uses the analogy again. I think I just threw it out quickly of the river, that you could you've got a river, you could build a bridge across the river, and that would enable you to get from point A on one side of the river to point B on the other side. Or if you wanted to use the river itself as a mode of transport, you get in your boat and you go under the bridge and along. So the direction of flow of the river current is orthogonal to the direction of the line that goes from one bank to the other. So it gives us two different senses of betweenness. There's the between being halfway from one side to the other, and there's the between us going along for as long as you like between the banks. And this is the difference in my sense between the transverse and the longitudinal. And I think, and what I'm arguing is that we have to have both together for things to cohere. Does that make sense?
I think that I just wonder if that's the case in every, if that would be the case in every instant. And that's actually the second thing that wondered me a little bit, that when you said at the end that everything, that you think everything has, can be thought of as having both assemblage and gathering. Because in the example you get Deleuze and Guattari give of the jigsaw puzzle, there it would be that at the end it's not an assemblage.
Oh, right. Yes.
The things that go together into a whole that erases the parts. So in these instances, it would not be. We could not think of them as an assemblage there.
That's true. In a perfect jigsaw puzzle, I think the way to answer it, I don't know how Deleuze would answer it, but the way I'd answer it is that actually, of course, no jigsaw is perfect, because the pieces have had to be cut using some mechanism. Suppose the pieces are wood, and you have actually cut it using a jigsaw, that particular kind of saw with a very thin blade that enables you to turn tight corners in wood. And so you then start thinking about the sawing operation, what happens there, and to what extent, how perfect actually is the fit between the pieces when in the very operation of sawing you've created some sawdust and lost some wood, and what's been going on there. It's a bit the same as with the brick wall, where you think, well, if the bricks were absolutely geometrically perfect, maybe you could build a wall without any mortar and it would all stand up very beautifully. But of course, it's not really like that. And the wall has to hold up, and then there's wind and rain and things like that. So you need to have the mortar to stick it together. So there's a level of always an element of imperfection in the join. So you could imagine a virtual jigsaw that is absolutely perfect, but a real jigsaw must deviate a little bit from that.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I guess my question goes back to your sort of equation of the E1, E2, and O1, O2.
Yeah.
And you point out that the putting together of E1, E2, E3 could be understood as O1. But then how would you envision the putting together of O1, O2? As in, how would you envision the relations between relations?
Oh, it's like metaphor in storytelling, isn't it? And in fact, when we're talking about a relation, it's not between one thing and another, but it's more like when you relate a story. It's a going along. So every relation is itself a line of the sort. In that first experiment, I drew this kind of wavy lines. Every relation is like that, a thread. And then when we talk about relations between relations, it must be the way in which those threads tangle together. So a relation between relations is itself the gathering, because each line in the gathering is a relation in itself. So it goes back to this whole thing and the different argument about the difference between a network and a meshwork. And you know, with the network, we assume that there are points, and you connect them up in some abstract way. But in the meshwork, there are lines, which and the lines come together in knots. But the thing about a knot is that it doesn't have a boundary. It's made of all these threads that are very densely packed in one place, but then sort of spreading out, loose ends going out in all sorts of different directions. So it's a very different kind of thing than a networked entity. So when I'm talking about relations between relations, I'm thinking in terms of this kind of a metaphor of weaving, really, of tangling threads rather than joined up elements, if that makes sense.
And then how would you define an entity then? If it seems like it's everywhere and boundaryless.
But you could think of it in two ways. You could think of it both as something like a blob which is like a lump of plasticine or something like that. And you say, okay, it has a certain substance here. You can see it's got a surface, and it's sort of self-contained. But you could also say, no, actually, it's something more like a knot, so that the entity itself is a locus of concentration, like where threads are very tightly bound together, which then spills out into in every which way. This affords two different ways of looking at things. I mean, I wrote a book which was about this, called The Life of Lines. And I started that book saying, well, we could think of the world as either made up of blob-like entities, or we could think of the world as woven, entangled from a great multitude of threads. And you can look at it both ways, but they give you quite different perspectives on things. And in a rhetoric that keeps going on about the building blocks of the world, we tend to start from one side. What if we started from the other side and said, no, actually, what if we thought of all the threads of the world? Then how would it lead us to think of things differently? And I'm very keen to say, it's not that it's one thing rather than the other, but we have to find a way in which these two things work together so that we end up with a world that both, when we look around, we think we can see all these entities. We can see tables and chairs and people and say, well, there's surely entities in the world. We can see them, we can feel them, we can touch them. But that's only half the story, because this world also coheres. It's tied together somehow. And we have to see, how does that tying work? That's it.
Thank you very much.
Right. As it seems that there are no more questions from the audience, I would like to thank you, Tim, once again for this talk, and that you accepted our invitation as our guest speaker. It was a great honor to have you. And yeah, hopefully we will see with rest of you during our next talk next week. So have a nice rest of the day, and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.